I'm not a big fan of using one-dimensional scales to explain and represent reality or aspects of reality because I think they leave out a lot of information. By a one-dimensional scale, I mean, for instance, if you rate a movie, how good it is from 1 to 5 stars, that'd be a one-dimensional scale. It could also be called a spectrum sometimes. And in order to explain what I mean by that, I'll use two examples, well, actually more than two examples, a couple of examples. So let's first use the example of a arm wrestling competition, right? We've got A versus B, and we're representing who's winning in terms of how much strength is applied on both ends on this one-dimensional scale, right? So we'll quickly notice a little problem. So in the first case, we have neither participants are putting a lot of strength, right? And so we get a 50-50 result. So our measurement on the scale is in the middle. In the second case, they're both putting a lot of strength. And so we get the exact same result on our one-dimensional scale where the result lies in the middle again, 50-50. And the same thing happens with our two second examples, or third and fourth. In this one, A is putting just a little bit of strength and B is putting a moderate amount. And so we get a 20-80. And in this one, A is putting no strength and B is putting a tiny bit of strength, and we get the same result, 20-80. So as you can see, we're losing a lot of context and nuance when we're just compressing and averaging all the data on a single scale. I'll use a second example here. And so let's imagine this scale represents your attraction to gender expression. And so on one hand, we'd have hyper feminine, and on the other hand, we have hyper masculine, okay? And then let's say again, we have A in red and B in blue. And A is attracted to only both extremes, and that's the only thing. And B is attracted only into the middle, so androgynous people. Well, if we compress the results, they both get exactly the same place on our one-dimensional scale in the middle, because that's our average. So as we can see with these examples, we're losing some information on the context and nuances, but there's even more types of details we're losing information about, right? So for example, we're not taking into account time, right? So these are measurements at one point in time. So for example, with our wrestling match, it's only a one snapshot in time. We don't know, like, because the dynamic could change with time, right? So maybe A is winning at the beginning, but then towards the end, B takes the power again and starts winning. So that's the type of information we lose. There's also a lot of details on the context and circumstances. Maybe A is very injured, and so it's not really a fair match. All of these types of information we don't have access to, and everything is just compressed very on one singular point. So in the two examples I gave, you could say a lot of the problems that I mentioned could be solved simply by using two independent one-dimensional scales. So we could have how much power A is putting into their arm and how much power B is putting into their arm, and we have two scales, and this way we are losing less information. There are also sometimes the measurements that are based on two different one-dimensional scales used as both axes for a graph. So for example, that's used for the political compass representation, with one axis that goes from left-leaning towards right-leaning, and another that goes from authoritarian to libertarian. And it's like some level of representation, but there's still a lot of details and nuances that we don't have access to, and that complicate the landscape. All right, so if one-dimensional scales are pretty lacking to describe some types or most types of dynamics, what's a better way or a better conceptual tool to think about them and try to understand what's going on? Well, I'd say polarities, or then a dynamic, a tension between two different poles, is usually a better way to think about these types of situations, because it allows for a lot more richness and details, even by just keeping just two poles vying over for control over time. And so if we take to take an example where we can contrast these one-dimensional scales versus polarities to understand the same phenomenon, we could use personality. And in this case, I don't know, perhaps you're familiar with the Big Five, which is a list. It's 5 scales that are based on, according to that theory, the 5 most prominent or important aspects of human personality. And so, for example, one of the scales is extroversion versus introversion. And so people range from one to another, and it's based on comparing to other people, right? So it's like a statistical analysis. It's based on bell curves. And so most people are in the middle, and then some people, but a lot less, are at the extremes. Another scale in that model is conscientiousness, which basically the 2 polarities is on one end you have people that are very tidy, that like to plan ahead and be organized, and on the other hand you have people that are more impulsive, that like to kind of go with the flow and who like spontaneity and figuring out things as they go and always staying more flexible, right? So according to that system, I lean a little bit closer towards the tidiness side of the spectrum, but just a little bit. However, this doesn't really explain, if we try to map it out on my life, that is like a lot of the time it's not a very good description, because actually I kind of fluctuate in between those 2 polarities. Like, sure, there's like a side of me that likes to plan ahead and to be very organized and internally consistent and know what's going to happen next, to be able to have some visibility. But there's some other parts of me, and at other times I like to be flexible, to be able to do what feels inspiring on the moment, and that feels spontaneous and authentic. And so if we just use this one single point on a scale, that seems a little bit incongruous with the result we have. Now if we use a different way of understanding this, of explaining this phenomenon, of trying to understand what's going on, we can use a polarity. So I've got 2 examples. Let's start with IFS. So IFS is the internal family system model. It's a psychological model to try and understand what's going on within people. And according to it, we have different parts. There's different parts of our personality, of our self, that are interacting within us. And this explains why, as people, we're not uniform. Like, it's not like we just want one thing and we're always super consistent in what we want and what we do, right? It's more like sometimes we do something a certain way, sometimes we do it another way, and there's some inner conflict. And so it makes a lot more sense through AFS if you've got different parts of you who have different interests and different goals. And so in this case, right, we could say that there's more than, there's like people have, a few dozens of parts. But in this case, we can only use 2. And so we could have an interaction between a part that's pretty tidy and organized and that likes, control and knowing what's going to happen, and another part that doesn't like to be restrained by limits and too much preparation and likes to be more free and spontaneous. And then they kind of get into this dynamic. So in IFS, there's like a concept called polarization, where basically 2 parts have 2 different strategies for a similar type of activity or need, and they compete between each other. And the more extremes they get, the more extreme one gets, the more extremes the other gets, in order to kind of try to find some equilibrium. And so basically, over time, one can be more often in power, so to speak. But if they're too extreme, and over time the other one will sometimes take the power back, and so there's this kind of exchange of power, which explains why people's behavior can change drastically between 2 different extremes. And so if we use again this example of tidiness and seriousness or conscientiousness versus kind of more free-spirited behavior, if you think about someone who'd be like a very big overachiever, very successful at work, they're very successful, they spend a lot of time working, they're very serious, but every now and then on weekends, or sometimes they go on big drinking binges, or they do hard drugs, and that seems weird. This type of behavior doesn't really make sense in contrast to our one-dimensional skills measure, where they're probably leaning a lot more towards the conscientious side of things. but then sometimes our behavior doesn't map on at all. It's inconsistent. But with our polarities and with the different, and this idea of a dynamic and a tension in between the two that can evolve with time and circumstances, now we have a lot more room to think about it, and it's a lot more, we have a lot more details and richness to kind of understand what's going on, even with models that, in the way I described it, still pretty simple. Another approach, for example, for personality, in contrast to the big five in this regard, would be, for example, the MBTI, which has cognitive functions. And so every person has 4 cognitive functions which work in 2 pairs of polarities, and so polarities are already baked into the system. And for example, if we use my type, you could say that the more orderly, planning, consistent part could map on TI and SI, whereas a more loosey-goosey, impulsive part could correspond to the extroverted intuition cognitive function, right? So I won't get too much into detail of this system, but it's just an example that when you simply use polarities, and it doesn't need you don't need to have all that much parts in your system, but it already affords a lot more room and detail to think about these types of dynamics. So basically, in conclusion, I'm not saying that there is no use for a one-dimensional scale. What it's good for is measuring one contrast between 2 polarities at one point in time, and that's all information we get. It's not that it's never useful, and it can be a little bit of a shorthand, but it's really not very informative by itself. And so if you think about it, it's just one level of complexity above a binary, right? So if we have a binary, we have good, bad, and then with a scale, we've got from gooder to from better to worse, right? But that's just one level of complexity more. If it's kind of like trying to summarize, like trying to explain reality with a one-dimensional scale is similar to trying to summarize an entire song into one chord, or to compress like a big detailed landscape picture and to reduce it into a very small thumbnail with about just 20 pixel widths. There's a lot of information you're losing. And they're pretty lacking to represent dynamics and tensions, in my opinion. I hope this video was somewhat interesting and entertaining. If you liked it, you might also be interested in my video on Pyrrhonism and philosophical skepticism, which is also talks about the limits of some ways of thinking or knowledge in general. And anyways, thanks for watching my video, and see you in the next one.